Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Thanksgiving week edition of the Off the Charts Football Podcast. I'm your host, Spratt from Sports Info Solutions. I'm joined, as always, by Schatz of Football Outsiders. We're actually going to be talking about the Thanksgiving games, doing a little bit of a preview for it later in the show. The games are remarkably good this year, so it's going to be pretty interesting, I think. But first, I wanted to talk to you, Aaron, about the big game from last week between the Seahawks and the Eagles. You actually teased on last show that was going to be a DVOA Bowl and that it featured the number 1 and number 2 teams in DVOA in a head-to-head matchup. Well, if that suggested that it might be a close game, that didn't really come to fruition as the Seahawks pretty much handled business there and now have become the number 1 team in DVOA. I want to talk about both teams, but let's start with the Seahawks. So now that they're the number 1 team in DVOA this year, and I read in your article, the DVOA Breakdowns article on Football Outsiders. Everybody definitely check that out if you haven't already. But they've actually finished each of the last 4 seasons as the number 1 team in DVOA. Is that sort of stretch unprecedented in DVOA history, Aaron?
Yeah, it is completely unprecedented. So the Cowboys were number 1 3 years in a row, from 1992 to 1994.
Yeah.
It's interesting because the Cowboys are actually 1 in 94 and the 49ers in 95, even though you would think it would be the other way around.
Right.
But, like, for example, the 49ers had some struggles early in the season in 94, particularly there's one game that stands out against Philly where they got clobbered like 40-8. But anyway, the Cowboys were number 1 for 3 straight years. And then when we look at we don't have DVOA before 1989, but we do have approximated numbers. And the Browns and Packers are number 1 for 3 straight years in the 50s and 60s. The Browns in the 50s and the Packers in the 60s. But no team has ever been number 1 4 straight years, even in those approximated numbers, other than Seattle.
Were the recent Dynasty Patriots from the early 2000s, did they have multiple seasons of that, or was that a little bit...
No,
so.
the recent Dynasty Patriots tended to be number 2 or 3 most years. They weren't really number 1 most of the time. So the Patriots were number 1, obviously, in 2007. But the Patriots have actually only been number 1 for the year twice, 2007 and 2010. When they were winning Super Bowls, they were 11th in 2001. Then they were actually higher when they didn't make the playoffs in 2002. They were 7th in 2002. Then 4th in 2003 and 2nd in 2004. But the Patriots were actually only number 1 twice, and neither of those was a year they made the Super Bowl. One of those years they didn't even make it to the Super Bowl.
I'm curious whether the public perception of these Seahawks is as good as they've actually been as a team then. And I'm kind of wondering what your thoughts are, Aaron, on whether there might be particular aspects or properties of this Seahawks run that has made them so consistently great. I mean, obviously there's a ton of talent to point to, but since their Super Bowl win from a few years ago, a lot of players have had to get paid. And so Russell Wilson is expensive now, Richard Sherman, Earl Thomas, Bobby Wagner, those guys all ended up getting contracts for the team. And so they were forced to let players Golden Tate, Russell Okung, Bruce Irvin, Brandon Browner, they had to let a lot of those guys go, but they've continued to be excellent in DVOA. So do you have any thoughts on how the Seahawks have been able to sort of maintain this level of excellence?
Well, the first thing is that their incredible ability to find undrafted free agents. Now, obviously, some of those undrafted free agents are getting paid now because they've been around for a few years, like Doug Baldwin.
Yeah.
But, Deshaun Sheed and their offensive linemen, who aren't that good, but at least they're not spending draft picks on most of them. And they just find Jermaine Kearse. They're finding a lot of these undrafted free agents who become useful players, which means that they come cheaply. Another thing is that the offensive line deficiency is somewhat masked by Russell Wilson's style.
Yeah.
So because Russell Wilson is so strong outside the pocket, he's able to sort of overcome some of the line problems when he's healthy. And the fact that they tend to get running backs who are good at breaking tackles, both Marshawn Lynch and Thomas Rawls, helps to overcome the problems of the offensive line because these guys don't necessarily need big holes to gain yardage. They tend to push forward for yardage. And also Wilson, by presenting the threat of the run, also opens things up for the running game.
Yep.
So, I mean, those are some of the reasons why I think this team is consistently good year after year. But then some of it also, listen, the fact that they've been number one for 4 straight years, there's a little bit of flukiness in it, in that in a couple of those years, they're only 1 or 2 percentage points from being number 2. Right? I mean, in 2012, they're only slightly ahead of Denver and New England. In 2014, they're only slightly ahead of Denver. Last year, they only went to number 1 in the final week because they clobbered Arizona, but Arizona sat its starters in the second half. So Seattle has been really dominant for 4 years, but they just as easily could have been, number 1 twice and number 2 twice, which would have been just as good, but we wouldn't be talking about it as much.
Yeah, that's probably fair. I really love what you said about their team building strategy. You can sort of see the line being drawn. It's like, hey, we're going to have these financial constraints because of the success that we've had and because the guys are free agents. So, where can we choose our weakness? And they chose the offensive line because they have talent like Russell Wilson and tackle-breaking runners to make up for that. And it just makes total sense. I wish you could see more teams sort of think about things that way. I feel like it happens some in baseball where a team like the Pirates, for instance, they have a lot of ground ball pitchers and they have really good infield defense, and those two things are complementary. I feel like there's not a lot of NFL teams that build their team based on their talent that way.
I think we can give Dallas some props for that.
Yeah.
While I criticized taking Ezekiel Elliott 4th, and I still think that it was a very high risk that may not have been worth it, because the odds are that Ezekiel Elliott would not have been as good as he is. I mean, he is that good, but
yes,
the odds taking a running back that high are still pretty bad. But I think they looked at it and they said, yeah, anybody can do well behind this line, but if we combine a really good running back with this really good line, it will be, we completely build our offense around it. It all becomes complementary. And I think that they've definitely built their team in a very specific fashion in that way. The Patriots also, when they couldn't sign Revis, they cut Brandon Browner because they said, Brandon Browner only makes sense if we have Revis and we're going to play this way. If we don't have Revis, we're not going to play this way. Now this player doesn't make any sense. So smart teams do think about how the puzzle pieces connect.
Yeah, it's no wonder that those are the teams that are consistently good every year as well.
Right. Well, when their starting quarterbacks are not hurt,
of course,
and they didn't grab a really good one in the 4th round.
Right.
Wasn't good last year.
Okay, then let's pivot to talk a little bit about the Eagles, because following the loss to the Seahawks, they're now just 5-5. But I found it interesting that Football Outsiders still gives them a 40.5% chance to make the playoffs. And I think that speaks a little bit to the discrepancy in how DVOA views this team and how the public at large might view this team, or maybe standard stats, however you want to think about it. But the Eagles are number 2 in DVOA on the season. And if I'm just taking the fan perspective, here is kind of the case I would present to you why that seems kind of strange. First, they've outscored their opponents by 55 points this season. Obviously, that's great, and I think that's the third best in the league behind just the Cowboys and Patriots. It's actually even better than the Seahawks. But a lot of that success happened early in the season, where the first 3 weeks they outscored the Browns, Bears, and Steelers by 65 points. They've actually been outscored by their opponents by 10 since then. So I'm curious about like the recency of this team. Like since their bye, which was in week 4, has this team been worse in DVOA? And is it possible that teams have figured out Wentz to a certain extent?
The answer is not as much as you think for the team, but with Wentz, the decline is dramatic.
Okay, interesting.
The defense has actually gotten better over the course of the season. Or not gotten better, sorry. They just haven't declined. The defense hasn't declined over the course of the season. So the Philadelphia defense has only 2 games this year where they're above 0, which for defense means not as good as average.
Right.
One was week 6, where they're basically at 0, and the other is this week against Seattle. The week 6 game was the loss to Washington, 27-20. Other than that, this defense has still been above average every game after we adjust for opponent. The offense, on the other hand, has definitely struggled for most of the season, except against Atlanta. they've really struggled since those first 3 weeks. And Wentz especially. So Wentz in the first 3 weeks of the season is 20.7% passing DVOA, so 21% better than average. Since the bye week, so weeks 5 through 11, he's minus 20% passing DVOA. So he's gone from being 20% above average to 20% below average. And, we've shown, our research generally shows you want to look at the long view more than the short view. Even our weighted DVOA looks at the last 8 games pretty much with full strength, and the 4 games before that are 2/3 strength. It isn't until you get to 3 months ago before we really start dropping the weight of games. That being said, we have never done research to look specifically at rookie or quarterbacks or brand new starters to ask, do teams, is it true? It's probably a good research project for us to do. Is it true that teams figure out first-time starters after a couple weeks? That definitely seems to be the case with Carson Wentz. But as far as the team goes, Philadelphia's best game this year by DVOA, of course, is the stomping of Pittsburgh.
Right, of course,
week 3.
yeah.
Their second best game was 2 weeks ago against Atlanta. And their third best game was in week 7 against Minnesota. So it's not like all their good games were early in the season. Once DVOA adjusts for the fact that Cleveland is horrendous and Chicago is bad, their good games have really been spread throughout the season. They've just lost all these games close. This was the first game they lost by more than a touchdown.
Yeah. When I asked that question about Wentz, I'm not even sure I'm specifically asking about him specifically, although clearly those numbers show that he hasn't been as effective. But it could just be like an overall offensive strategy thing, too. You mentioned earlier in the season how this team was like relying on the really short passing attack, and that's why maybe the traditional numbers that look so good for Wentz were masking the fact that he wasn't really doing a ton. And I think when you sort of stretch that out over the course of the season, that shows up, too. Like Wentz has a low 6.6 yards per attempt this season. That's actually behind Alex Smith and makes him one of the shortest passing guys in the league right now. He's actually thrown 21% of his passes behind the line of scrimmage, tied for the most among primary starters, and completed only 50% of his passes for 10 or more yards. Just to give people a little bit of perspective there, guys like Brady and Breeze, Matt Ryan and Rivers and Russell Wilson, they're all in the 55 to 60% range on those 10-plus yard passes. So this offense seems very, very much like Kansas City-style short passes, not stretching the field. And I just wonder whether that's something that defenses can adjust for and defend.
In a way, I don't know why they had to adjust from it from the get-go. We knew this was going to be the Kansas City offense from the beginning.
Yeah, with Peterson, of course,
Peterson.
yeah.
This is the Andy Reid offense. And the Andy Reid offense has had deep passes in it in the past, but it hasn't the last couple of years with Alex Smith not really that good at that, and Wentz has been awful on downfield passes. So I know that ESPN's QBR, and listen, I know we have a lot of people who read our site and listen to this podcast who will question QBR because it comes out of the worldwide leader and everything they do. Some people are like, oh, big company, but it is designed by a lot of good people, and there's a lot of good stuff in it that I wish I could put in DVOA if we could chart games live with a whole armada of people.
Yeah.
And one of the things they do is that they give less credit to quarterbacks who mostly throw short because this feeling is that deeper throws are more the quarterback's ability and shorter throws are more the yards after the catch. And they have Wentz 30th out of 32 qualified quarterbacks because he throws short so much. And, I think, listen, for a rookie, he's been useful. But early on, people were singing his praises to a ridiculous extent. And I tweeted a couple weeks ago, get off the Wentz wagon and get on the Schwartz wagon.
Yeah, yeah. And
I mean, let's talk about why Philadelphia might make the playoffs. It's defense. It's not Wentz. Wentz is a nice little, he's having a nice little Alex Smithy season. But he's being way outperformed by Dak Prescott. Obviously, Prescott has more help. But the offense is not what's making it happen for this team. It's the defense and the special teams, which are both number one in DVOA.
And speaking of that defense, I wanted to ask you a little bit more about that. So they're the number one defensive DVOA team, but they have allowed 5.6 yards per play this season on defense, which is about league average. So could you give us a little bit of the reasonings behind how DVOA views them so much better than that sort of traditional metric?
Right. So I wrote about this a bit this week. I said this week, I swear to God, I've written so much about Philadelphia this year that they're constructing a Wawa in the back of my apartment.
I actually get that joke now that I live up here, by the way. I'm an honorary
member of the Tanier family. I've written so much about the Eagles this year.
I was going to say, I wouldn't have understood that joke 2 years ago, but now that I live up here, that's right in my wheelhouse, so thanks for that.
Football Outsiders, we pride ourselves on as many silly regional mentions as possible. Why should we stick to just the region I live in?
Yeah, I like it.
Okay, so opponent-wise, they've played the hardest schedule of opposing offenses in the league, with 5 of their games coming against the top 10 offenses. Now, obviously, like, not every offense they've played has been spectacular. Have we mentioned the Cleveland Browns lately? But
we have.
That was, 10 weeks ago. They've played a lot of really good offenses. They have a lot of turnovers, both fumbles, both recovered by them and recovered by the offense, but they've created fumbles and a lot of interceptions. The other is that they are a really high risk-reward defense, and that's why DVOA likes them more than the average yards per play. They have forced more losses of 3 or more yards per play than any other defense. And that's really important because those losses matter more than just averaging out all the yards, because those losses
and drives, right?
Difficult situations on 2nd and long and difficult situations on 3rd and long. They also, however, have given up more big plays. So only Green Bay has given up a higher percentage of plays of 30 yards or more. And in general, DVOA tends to gradually discount yardage once you get past about 30 yards, because at that point, as far as predicting the future, it tends to be giving up big plays like that tends to be more about where you were on the field rather than that you gave up a big play.
Yeah.
Sometimes a guy runs 80 yards and he can't make it 85 because you catch up to him from behind. But it's much more common that the receiver beats the cornerback and there's no safety. And if that play started at your own 30, that's a 70-yard touchdown. But if it started at the 50, it's a 50-yard touchdown. And if it starts at the opposing 30, it's a 30-yard touchdown. So it starts to discount the yardage a little bit once you get really, really high. And the Eagles have allowed a lot of those big plays. Now, is there something about their defense that tends to allow really big plays? There may be, because, they're so... bringing pressure is so important, but they're not bringing pressure by blitzing. So it's not like they're giving up big plays by blitzing and not leaving enough guys back in coverage. What Jim Schwartz believes in is having a front four that's strong enough that it can get the pressure itself, and then you have 7 guys back in coverage. So I do think there's just a little bit of sort of random fluke chance to all the really big plays they've given up.
Yeah, it sounds like it could be random. I don't know if you have any thoughts about this, but is there anything to the idea that maybe they are a gambling defense? Like the reason they're forcing these turnovers is because, I don't know, maybe their cornerbacks abandon routes to try to pick off the ball and that can lead to big plays? Or is that just idle speculation on my part?
That's possible, but I can't say that I've watched Philadelphia's corners enough closely to be able to really have an opinion on that. I will say, though, like I said, Jim doesn't like to blitz too much. So it's not that they're sending 6 and 7. Like if Arizona or the Jets are giving up a lot of big plays, then it's really explainable because they're probably blitzing 6 and 7 guys. But Philly's not doing that.
That's interesting. So, like, taking a bigger look at the NFC wildcard picture, the Packers and the Bengals have really kind of fallen from grace from recent weeks, and the Eagles play them the next 2 weeks. Does that change? Like a few weeks ago, we were talking about how they had the most difficult schedule over the second half of the season. Has that changed because of that? I mean, it's probably changed because the Seahawks game's behind them, but otherwise, with the home Packers, at Bengals, home Redskins, at Ravens, home Giants, home Cowboys, still seems kind of hard on paper. What does Football Outsiders see that with their schedule rankings?
Yeah, so they've got the number 6 pass schedule and the number 8 future schedule. It has dropped from number 1 because they have the Seahawks behind them, because the Packers and Bengals look a little worse. I will note that this doesn't incorporate home and away, right?
Yeah,
the schedule rating here doesn't account for the fact that they do have 4 home games. Also point out they go to Baltimore in Week 15, which could be a game, one of the games in NFL history where there are actually negative points scored. I think that game is going to have so few points that what they're going to do probably is for every time that those defenses stop each other, they're just going to give Louisville points or something.
Yeah, I like it.
They'll just send points to the Big 12. Maybe the Big 12 can send some points to that game the way we give money to charity. It really is the NFC East dominating the wild card. It's going to be very unlikely for a team from another division to win a wild card. And the fact is, while our numbers may like the Eagles a lot better than the Giants and somewhat better than Washington, the Giants have a 2-game lead.
Yeah,
and Washington has, 1.5 game lead on the Eagles? I mean, it's going to be tough for the Eagles to catch up. I mean, we think the Eagles are a much better team than their record, but it's going to be tough to catch up. Now, the good news is that they get to play those two teams at home. So if Philadelphia wants to make it to the playoffs, the best thing they've got going for them is that the three of the teams that are their competitive, I mean, Green Bay is mostly out of it at this point, but Green Bay, Washington, New York, they play at home. And Week 17, Dallas could possibly have clinched the number 1 seed. So they are in the same position Miami is in, where they're sort of stuck rooting for a division rival, because both Miami and Philadelphia are in a nice position if the Cowboys and Patriots clinch the number 1 seed by Week 17 to possibly win against backups and make a wild card.
Okay, interesting. Now, just because the wild card is sort of whittled down to a few different teams doesn't mean there are not some interesting division races in the NFC, particularly in the North. And so I think that's going to be a segue to talk about the Thanksgiving slate this year, which is actually really, really good. I mean, Aaron, I love Thanksgiving. It's my favorite day of the year, and I'll watch whatever garbage NFL games are on the air because it's really fun to do. But this year, they're really strong. And I think it actually starts with the first game. This is probably the most anticipated matchup in my mind between Minnesota and Detroit. And you mentioned in your ESPN playoff odds article that this is the most important game in terms of playoff odds of the season so far. So can you explain a little bit about that and how this might have huge implications in the North?
Yeah, I don't remember a Thanksgiving slate better than this year. This is really good. If the Lions win this game, their playoff odds go to 62%, and the Vikings drop to 43%. But if the Vikings win this game, their playoff odds go to 86%, and the Lions drop to 19%. Now, I mean, the Vikings are bigger than the Lions in the playoff odds for two reasons. One is that our ratings like the Vikings better. The second is the Vikings already have a head-to-head win over Detroit. So if they win this game, they now automatically win the head-to-head tiebreaker no matter what happens with division games or shared opponents or any of that. Whereas the Lions win this game, now if these two teams finish tied, it goes to all these other tiebreakers. But this game is really important for determining the North. It's possible that the team that loses this game may lose the division. The team that loses this game could win the division, especially if it's Minnesota. But if Minnesota wins in Detroit, they come close to icing the division.
Yeah, and based on what we were just talking about a minute ago with the NFC East and the Eagles and such, neither of these teams, in your mind, are really in the wild card mix if they fail to win the division?
They are in the wild card mix more than anyone else. By the playoff odds, the outsiders' playoff odds, they each win a wild card in 6.7% of simulations, which is not a lot, but is more than any team outside the NFC East.
Man, that's crazy. Well, let's talk a little bit specific about the game itself. I'm curious how the strengths and weaknesses of these two teams will actually match up with each other. The Lions, so they have the number 14 offensive DVOA. Is it fair to say that that's skewed heavily toward passing? I'm guessing that because last week they only had 14 rushing yards, and they haven't rushed for 100 yards in a game since week 2.
Yeah, it's absolutely skewed towards passing. So Detroit's offense right now is 9th passing and 29th running.
Okay, and so given the Vikings...
Hold on, I have to interrupt you. I made a mistake.
Yeah, I was about to say, didn't the Lions win with a Golden Tate flip over? Yeah.
So actually, it's that our numbers think the Vikings are much better, but if the Lions win this game, then they have the sweep.
Right.
Which means even if they lose games later in the season against teams like Dallas and New York, because they have to go to Dallas and to New York in weeks 15, 16, they could lose those games and still be in good position because they would have the sweep of Minnesota. My apologies.
Okay. No, I think that clears it up. That makes total sense. What we were just talking about before was that the Lions are heavily skewed towards the passing attack in favor of the running attack. The Vikings are really good in defense, I think, in general. They're number 6 in DVOA. But does that skew more toward pass defense or rush defense?
Yeah, it skews more towards pass defense.
So that seems like a good place to be when you're playing the Lions, right?
Absolutely. The Vikings are 4th against the pass and 12th against the run. So the fact that they tend to give up a little bit more running is meaningless pretty much against Detroit.
Yeah. So like that seems like a pretty good advantage for the Vikings there. On the flip side of things, so we've talked about this a number of times already this year, but the major weakness of the Vikings offense has been their offensive line play. And I'll point out a couple of stats here, that their offensive line has blown 98 blocks this year. Only the Buccaneers lineman has done more. And some of the specific players, tackle TJ Clemmings has 23 blown blocks, which is the most in the league. Jake Long has blown 3.2%, a block on 3.2% of his snaps, which is top 5. He actually just landed on IR.
Playing anymore.
So, like, you would assume that things are actually going to get even worse from there. So, like, this is a bad situation. But considering that they're playing the Lions, who, I think they're 32nd in defense. Are they actually the worst defensive DVOA team?
They are, in fact, the worst defensive DVOA team still, and in particular, the worst pass defense.
Yeah, so that seems like a great spot to be in for the Vikings as well, where if they had this one glaring weakness, the Lions themselves may not be able to take huge advantage of it.
And it is really strange that Detroit is last in pass defense, because Darius Slay has been injured for a few weeks, or was injured for a few weeks, but still very good cornerback. 2 years ago, they were one of the top defenses in the league, playing the same scheme. The pass rush has really been a problem this year. And some of it is that they were missing Ziggy Ansah for 3 weeks there in the middle. But they're 18th in adjusted sack rate. So that's not as good as you would want them to be. It's not horrible. Better when Ansah's healthy. But it's like, okay, there's this good corner. There's a reasonable, the pass rush is not as good as you want, but at least there's one good pass rusher you got to look out for. What's going on here? The linebackers, I guess, and just the safeties have been questionable. And the other cornerbacks, and the DeAndre Levy is just never going to be healthy again. I don't know what's going to happen with him. And why the Detroit defense is so bad is a bit of a question, but it's not good.
No, I wish I had looked up before the show like some of their splits based on the sides of the field, because I have to imagine a lot of teams attack the middle of the field, especially when Levy's been out most of this year. I bet like tight ends and other slot people are just like eating them alive without any healthy linebackers at all, but especially good coverage linebackers.
Well, I actually will load that up, and we'll see what the numbers say as far as the types of receivers and the direction.
Great. While you look that up, I'll point out that Detroit is 25th in defensive pressure rate. So Ansah himself may be really good, but as a group, this team isn't getting a lot of pass pressure. They didn't get a lot of pass pressure on the Vikings in Week 9 when they played them. So again, it seems like advantage Vikings again. We think they're the better team in terms of overall season performance with DVOA. And they seem to have the advantage on both the offensive and defensive sides, given their specific strengths and weaknesses. So,
and I'll tell you that definitely Detroit is getting killed by slot receivers.
Yeah, okay, that makes total sense to me.
Dead last against what we call other receivers, so not the 1 or 2 receivers. They're 30th against running backs in the passing game, and they're 27th against tight ends.
Yeah. Okay.
So it's not the top receivers. It's not Stephon Diggs that's going to do the damage. It's going to be
Kyle
the little
Rudolph.
stuff.
Yeah.
Detroit is 22nd in the league against deep passes, but they are 31st in the league against short passes. And if we look up sort of what Detroit has done against slot receivers to see who's had the really big games against them, Jamison Crowder had 108 yards. Eddie Royal, 111 yards in Week 4 against them. Philip Dorsett in Week 1, 94 yards when Moncrief and T.Y. Hilton were healthy. Brian Quick, who's an outside receiver, obviously, because Austin's in the slot, but he's their third option. Yeah. 61 yards with a 100% catch rate in Week 6. Marquise Lee had 52 yards and a touchdown this week. So they are getting killed by the opponent's third options. Now they also picked Bortles off twice on throws to Lee, but I'm going to attribute that to Mr. Bortles, not to the Lions.
So I guess I'll just say, seems like all the signs are pointing towards the Vikings. So I'll take the Lions to win this just because they're just magical in close games. And I'm going to really enjoy watching this one.
They are the home team. And I do believe that Scott Kazmard said that the record is seven fourth quarter comebacks in one season. And if Detroit does one more, they'll tie the record.
That's amazing. Well, definitely looking forward to watching that. But let's spend a little bit of time before we wrap up talking about the other two Thanksgiving games. The middle game is between Washington and Dallas. According to your playoff odds, Dallas has pretty much locked this thing up at 98.5%. But I feel like the Redskins, I don't know, they could be in a little bit of jeopardy. I mean, if they lose this game, they're currently sitting at 62.6% chance to make the playoffs, which makes them, I think, the second wild card favorite behind the Giants, possibly the first. I don't really know how that would stand between those two, but if they lost this game, how many games do you think they're going to need to win over the rest of their season to actually make it in? They're 6-3-1 right now.
Well, if DVOA can be believed, Philadelphia is most likely to finish roughly 9-7.
Okay.
And therefore, Washington would need to finish 9-6-1. But I think if they want to be safe, they really need to finish 10-5-1. So that would mean that if they lose this game, they will need to basically go 4-1 over their last 5 games. If they it's actually better to say this: if they lose to Philly in Week 14, they need to win the rest of their games.
Yeah, that's tough. I mean, look at the schedule.
If they beat Philly in Week 14, they could probably lose 2 other games.
Yeah. I say that's really tough because look at the schedule. The next 3 weeks, all on the road, at the Cowboys, at the Cardinals, at the Eagles. They host the Panthers, then go at Bears, and close with home against the Giants. They could potentially get benefits if some of the teams have sort of locked into their situations, but I don't know. I think that their situation is a little bit precarious. They could really use this win against the Cowboys this week, which I'm sure will be hard to do given their super short week.
A little bit, but the thing is, they're a better team than Arizona. They're a better team than Chicago, and by significant amount, I think. Enough to make them probably favorites on the road against Arizona and Chicago.
Yeah.
They're better than Carolina this year, and they're actually better than the Giants this year. And the Giants could be locked into the 5 spot by the time we hit Week 17. So I don't think it's ridiculous to imagine that Washington would lose to Dallas and lose to Philly and still win a wild card by winning their other 4 games. The other possibility is that Philly doesn't go 4-2, that Philly goes 3-3 over the next few weeks, in which case it would be pretty tough for Washington to blow the spot.
Yeah, for sure. The night game, I think, was a lot more interesting until Andrew Luck had a concussion and is likely to miss this week. We have Pittsburgh.
Scott Tolzien! All right, it's the Scott Tolzien experience.
I feel really bad for this guy because the Colts, I mean, we've talked about some of the problems with this team, but they're allowing the most offensive pressure in the league, so he's going to just be under constant duress. I mean, is Pittsburgh pretty much already won this game, or do you see any road for the Colts to stay in it?
Here's the problem for the Colts, is that Pittsburgh's defense is much better against the run than the pass. Right? All defenses, for the most part, it's very rare to have a defense that's actually better against the pass than against the run, because in general, in the NFL, the pass is more efficient than the run.
Yeah.
So there's only 2 teams in the league this year where the actual DVOA, because we combine all passes and runs together in Team DVOA, there's only 2 teams that actually are lower against the pass than the run. I mean, allow less efficiency, and that's Philly and Denver. Okay? So when you add to that, Pittsburgh is 16th ranked against the pass and 11th ranked against the run. So they're much better against the run. And the Colts offense this year, and this is kind of kooky because of luck, but they are so much better running the ball. They are 5th running and 20th passing. And it's not because of Frank Gore. It's because of the offensive line. They actually seem to have an offensive line that does something right. Unfortunately, that something is not pass protection. They're like 4th or 5th in the league in adjusted line yards and 32nd in adjusted sack rate.
That's crazy.
So to win, the Colts have to essentially run the ball down Pittsburgh's throats and not fall behind ever.
Which is also going to be tough given that the Colts have the 27th overall DVOA and 31st defensive DVOA. So it's not like they're going to likely be able to limit what Pittsburgh can do offensively.
Right.
So given that, I feel like the Steelers, they've had a really crazy season, a lot of turmoil, but all of a sudden they look like they have a really clear path to the playoffs. They're 5-5. They're going to dodge Andrew Luck this week. They still have one more game against the Browns. If they win those 2, they're going to be sitting at 7 wins. And then I feel like with their other 4 games, they go 2-2. I think they're probably in at that point, right?
Yeah, I mean, honestly, Pittsburgh's had a clear road for a couple of weeks now because, no matter what, we've always known that after week 10, their schedule was going to get so much easier. And Baltimore's was going to get so much harder. So this was always sort of on the horizon. We always saw this coming. Not only has Pittsburgh been the better team by our ratings, especially if you don't include the Landry Jones game.
Yeah.
But even if you do include the Landry Jones game, they're still the better team. But the schedule difference between them and Baltimore is just so big. And the one game between the teams is
at the Steelers
in Pittsburgh on Christmas Day. So, and that's actually going to be a really important game, and I'd like to apologize to the National Basketball Association for all of the eyeballs that will be taken away from them by the fact that the NFL is playing on Christmas Day for the first time in the middle of the afternoon that I can remember, and it's going to end up being a really important game. But Pittsburgh it's really likely Pittsburgh wins this division.
So Baltimore by record is tied also at 5-5 with the Steelers. They have the Bengals twice, home for the Dolphins, at the Patriots, home for the Eagles, and at the Steelers the rest of the way. So on paper, obviously, that looks pretty challenging. The playoff odds, I think,
it's challenging now that the Bengals have so many injuries, but that doesn't help them against the Patriots.
And the Dolphins looking really strong.
They have to go to Pittsburgh, and Miami is playing really
so well. Well, the playoff odds give the Steelers a 57.6% chance to make it, and the Ravens a 34.6%. So, obviously weighted in the Steelers' favor. We'll have to see whether the Ravens can maybe knock off the Steelers in Pittsburgh later in the year, because that could swing things. But Pittsburgh, at least for this week, looking really good. Okay, Aaron, I think that pretty much covered everything we wanted to cover. So I want to wish you a happy Turkey Day. I hope you have a really good time. I'm heading home to see the family and eat a lot and watch a lot of football, so I'm looking forward to it myself.
I'm heading 2 towns over to see the family. All right.
Nice. That'll be fun, too.
It's a much shorter trip, which means more watching football. I can't wait to scarf the turkey down as quickly as possible so I can get to the second half of Washington-Dallas.
Excellent. All right, everyone. Well, thanks so much for listening. Be sure to subscribe to our podcast, Off the Charts Football, and check out all the great work that Aaron and the other Football Outsiders writers are doing on footballoutsiders.com. Thanks so much, and we'll talk to you next week.